Thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Wilson.
And I'm Chris Ehmke.
And you're listening to Diesel Performance Podcast. Chris, we are back after our first week off.
Dude, where did the time go?
I don't know. Guys, we got a lot of great shows lined up for you in the future. We're going to be diving into some research topics. We're going to be diving into some broader interview topics. But one of the things that Chris and I have always wanted to get into is really talking about power recipes in a very real way, or maybe just grabbing a truck, which is what we're going to do today.
Right.
We're going to talk about the 5th Gen Cummins. God, I feel like we get so many calls about these trucks.
You know, I mean, rightfully so, right? They're the 5th Gen Dodge. It's the 19 to current. It's the newest Cummins platform on the block, right? So a lot of times guys are coming from an older truck into a newer truck, right? And just the natural progression, this is what they're going with. Or maybe they're new to diesel and, you know what, this is just what they ended up stumbling across. It's a great truck. It's a great platform. We've been very favorable to them over the years, you know, just doing the R&D and whatnot. So, you know, we figured, you know, we're getting a lot of inquiries. We're getting a lot of how-to questions, and we've been asked about weak links and, you know, what some upgrade options are, and figured, hell, why not just talk about it?
Absolutely.
So.
And before we dive too far in, we want to give a shout out to our sponsors. You know, those include WC Fab. They have everything that you need. If you need it powder coated, if you need it looking cool under the hood, if you need it flowing more air under the hood, they are the go-to. That's who we use. That's who we recommend.
Yeah. And they've really been expanding their product line, right? Like, you think about their tenure in the market, right? Duramax oriented, that was their roots. If you talk to any of the Whirly boys, they are GM to the death, right? But they've expanded their product catalog. You know, they offer a bunch of parts about the platform we're going to talk about today, being the 5th Gen Dodges, the 4th Gen Dodges, and they offer, you know, piping kits and intake horns. They even do them for the Power Strokes. They have a 6.7 line for the Power Stroke that they're going to be dropping soon. So they've definitely positioned themselves to be kind of like your one-stop shop for all three brands these days.
That's it, man. Absolutely. Exergy Performance, that's who we get our high-pressure fuel system components from. Why do we work with them, Chris?
Reliability, consistency. Those are probably two of the big things. I remember back, you know, going a decade ago when you wanted to make big power in a common rail engine, it was always dual fuelers. You always ran 2 CP3 pumps. If I got $1 for every time a splitter would fail, right? The controller.
Say about them. Like the controllers were always a
or
nightmare.
One of the FCAs on one of the pumps, the whole system would get upset.
Try troubleshooting that.
Yeah. And then now, you know, they've really, in my opinion, they're like the pioneer of stroker pumps. And now I can be confident, you know, if I want to make 800 horse, a 10 mil pump will get us there. You want to make almost 1,000, a 12 mil pump can get us there. They have their 14 millimeter pumps, which we've seen 1,400 horsepower out of. And they recently just released at PRI a couple weeks ago their Alpha 550 pump, which is a stroker pump on steroids with more info to come. So, you know, it's really cool to see that they're, you know, kind of pioneering in developing new products for, you know, race application and high performance diesel application. And especially in a time now where it seems like some of that stuff's falling off, companies like Exergy are coming to the plate like, hey, hold on, we have some cool stuff in the pipeline.
Yeah.
So it's cool to see.
I love it. XDP, your one-stop shop for diesel performance. You can find a handful of featured stealth turbos over there at XDP. Jump on and check those out. We've loved working with them. We've worked with them for a long time. Yep. Always glad to have them on as being a part of the podcast. And last but not least, Chris, Calibrated Power, home of DuramaxTuner.com. Yep. They pay the bills, not just for the show, but for you and I.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff coming through the woodwork here as well. You know, we have some really cool content that we're going to be coming out with in the next couple months. We're doing a lot of behind-the-scenes testing. I know Justin, our producer, he's been filming Nick a shit ton. There's been a lot of data collection. I know you've been working in the back end, just doing a bunch of, you know, documentation as far as like how the videos should come together. So there's a lot of cool turbo comparison stuff that we've already started to release. We have some parts on some other trucks that we're going to be releasing. We also have some more turbochargers in the near future. Our engine dyno's up and running, which is awesome.
That was so cool this morning. Yeah.
It's just at the end of the year when we take a step back and go, what did we accomplish? We are now starting to realize like, okay, well, 24 is going to be exciting.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm with you on that. All right. Well, hey, back into the 5th Gen Cummins. Chris, this is your world, man. You have been on the cutting edge of Cummins performance since like what, 2015, 2016, something like that. I forget when you bought the black truck.
It's crazy to think, as someone who, an enthusiast, right? Like I just wanted to afford a truck at one point.
Came in as a 24 valve guy.
Yeah, 12 valve guy at one point. Yeah.
Jumped into a 06 common rail.
Yeah, bought the cheapest one I could find. It was an 07 5.9.
07, yep. 2-wheel drive.
2-wheel drive, 350,000 miles, and we did a bunch of stuff to that truck.
Yeah.
Trans, turbo. Ended up getting a motor because the motor ended up getting hurt. Got a set of 100s and a 12 mil, and I sold that truck to a really good customer of ours. That made 750 horsepower, and that truck was a really cool learning experience. And from that, I ended up graduating into the 15 Ram, which we've had on the show, talked about a bunch. We used that truck over at Calibrated for a lot of R&D for many years.
That's right. Ran emissions-equipped twin turbo kit for many years.
Emissions on twin kit. We learned a lot about the 68 RFE from a tuning perspective, to built transes and tuning those, to our Mach 1 series and STR turbos that we currently have on the market. All of that was developed on that 15. So we had a lot of good data to compare, like, okay, this is how a compound stuff turbo setup runs. Can we get a single turbocharger to replicate or be somewhat similar? So, a lot of downtime with that truck. That truck's been apart and put back together more times than I would ever care to talk about. But, there was a lot of learning that took place with that. And, it was one of those where that truck was at like the final stages of ownership for myself, and Nick and I worked a deal. He wanted to keep the truck around for more testing, and I wanted to get into a newer truck.
Yeah.
And I promised myself, like, I'm not going to do any R&D. I'm not throwing my hat in the ringer for anything. I'm going to get a newer truck, and I'm going to leave it alone. And stock trucks are just boring. And here we are, just kind of going through the same motions of the stages, just as our customers would. And we're doing it in a way that I think is a little bit more level-headed. We're not just throwing compounds into the truck and a bigger turbo into the truck, but really just starting with the basic bolt-ons and some of the limitations and weaknesses in the transmission to say, hey, here is a step-by-step blueprint if you wanted to build a cool truck down the road, but you want to do it in stages. Or, you want to throw this part on the truck? Well, here's what you're actually going to see in the real world, from dyno to data logging as far as how the turbo performs and all these different little attributes that guys call in and ask about. So that's what we're currently going through.
Absolutely. Now, 5th gen, what years does that reference?
So that'd be a 19 through current, so 2024 is what that would support.
Okay.
Over at Calibrated, currently we offer engine calibration and trans calibration for your 19 to 23. There has been a 24 floating around here the last couple of weeks, so hopefully we'll be at market with the 24 support here before too long. So
now the tuning on these has gotten more complicated throughout the years. Back in the day with the 5.9s, we hooked up to it with the EFI Live and you flashed it. I mean, that's really as complicated as it was. The early 6.7s, I think we had pretty easy access to. It was around 18, 19 when it started to get a little more complicated.
Well, keep in mind, when we originally released 4th gen support back in 15, you had to have a bully dog to unlock the ECM. So there was a separate hardware to do the unlock.
Yeah.
And even prior to that, like if you had a late 3rd gen 6.7 or an early 4th gen 6.7 and you were tuning it with EFI Live, you had to have an RSA patch to flash into the controller to unlock it. Then you could flash the tune file.
That's right. RSA patches. I do not miss people
memory
calling
lane.
in.
Paul, I'm taking down memory lane right now.
People used to call in, just because they couldn't figure out what the hell this RSA patch was. Yeah.
So, you look at it in today's world, like the earlier the earlier late 4th gen, your 13 to 17, we ended up being able to get away from doing an unlock in companies like EFI Live and EasyLink and HP Tuner. They were able to develop a flash protocol to just flash the controller, and that's that. Okay. In 18, a bypass cable, a CAN bypass cable was needed, okay, to go under the dash. And that is basically 18 to current. Like you have to have that no matter what. But what's interesting is you can basically take a handheld and flash an 18, a 19, a 20, a 21, no problem. In 22, there's a new encryption in the ECU. So the 22 to 24 fifth gen Dodges are where things get a little bit more complicated, where you actually have to have an unlocked controller from an earlier year model truck. So essentially you need a 19 to 21 controller.
Okay.
Or if you're like big money, you could go to Cummins and just buy a new ECM that Ram has never physically flashed.
Yeah, this is such a weird concept to me. So Cummins manufactures the ECMs.
Yes.
But as soon as they go to Ram, which is the distributor, that's who you're actually buying the truck from, they flash it and lock everybody out.
Correct.
Fuck you, Ram.
Yeah,
I'm just playing.
shit.
I'm just playing.
So it's funny because like guys will call in and they'll say like, well, I had a 19 or a 20 and I went to a 22 or a 23, and I have to be the one to tell them like, yeah, like there might be minimal changes, like in 24 or in 23 maybe the dash is a little different or the hood is different, but the power plant itself is all relatively the same. It's similar calibration strategy throughout those trucks, but the cost is 4 times. Because of the ECM.
Right.
So, it's one of those where I'm sure in due time, it's only a matter of time before things get a little cheaper on the tuning front. But as of right now, if it's a 22 plus truck, like it stinks. It's pricey.
Yeah. And I always feel like the price in relative to the cost of the truck is actually pretty affordable.
Yeah.
If we just think
if you're going to back into it from the Paul way of thinking, like you're not wrong. I mean, here's the thing, right? You go in 19, you could have bought a 5th gen, out the door, fully loaded for $50,000-$60,000.
Right.
You want to tune that truck? Okay. You're $1,800. Yeah, it is what it is. You're going to go buy a truck in 2023. That same truck in 19 that was for $50,000-$60,000 is going to run you 90 to 100 grand now. So
that's right.
It's up in cost, but I guess the problem is it's just like you're not gaining anything more. Like when the L5P stuff came out, for example, in the Duramax, and prices were up, well, you were getting more for the truck. You were getting 150, almost 200 horsepower more just calibration.
Yeah. So we went from 120 horsepower out of an LML top end, right?
Yeah. To 150. Yeah.
I guess the thing with LMLs is or L5Ps, when those came out and you had to buy HP tuners, unlocked ECMs, which you still do for the most part, but the price was so high.
Yeah,
I want to say it was $3,600 just for the ECM. Then you had to buy
remember,
the MPVI.
They originally released the ECM and then jacked up the price.
Yeah.
So there's been like 6 different price structures for that. And we're also seeing that now in the 22 plus RAM stuff. What we were able to get ECMs for a year ago, those prices have almost doubled. And then there's core charges that have almost doubled. So it's a weird time.
And that's what I've seen in this industry is technology does eventually catch up to convenience, right? We all want the convenience of just plugging it in and flashing it.
Of course.
And nowadays, now with L5Ps, for example, here we are all these years later. Last year, we finally got the ability to remote flash.
With the unlock cable,
yeah. So you were able to remotely unlock your ECM without having to pull it out of the truck.
Do
you remember reading all of the forum posts around L5P? This will never happen. You'll never be able to flash it. This is what the NSA uses for encryption. You'll never be able to do it. And then, yada yada yada. First, you get the unlocked ECMs, and then now all of a sudden you're able to unlock the ECMs in the truck. With the Cummins stuff, the process, honestly, I don't think is as bad as what it is in the L5Ps for swapping ECMs. The job's a little bit easier, isn't it?
I'll tell you that the swapping process from a calibration side is a little bit more simple, but swapping the physical ECM sucks because it's on the engine, on the driver's side of the engine, and there's really no clear-cut way to get to it. Okay, so I've done a couple swaps on the newer trucks where like guys had dual alternators. It's a shit show. There's no room. You can't get in there from the top. So the only other option is to like jack the truck up and pull the driver's side wheel well out.
Right.
And then remove the intercooler pipe and twist it. And then you have some access. But you're like reaching over the tire. Like it's not a very comfortable operation to necessarily get to. So it has its inconveniences, right? It's not a straight shot and an easy install, but it's not the worst thing to do.
Sure.
But I would say an L5P ECM swap is probably a little bit easier.
Okay. Yeah. The actual physical ECM.
The swap itself.
The tune process on an L5P
is probably
pretty involved.
I think if you're doing an ECM swap on an L5P and you have to do the VATS relearn, that's where a lot of the complications come in.
Okay.
When with the Cummins, with the way we use HP Tuner for that stuff, the way the flash protocol takes place is it learns the keys back to the truck. So there is no remote start issue. There is no VATS issue. Once it's flashed, it's done. So it simplifies the install from that perspective. As far as flashing of the trucks, they're going to be relatively the same. As far as using VCM scanner or VCM editor to read the file, flash the file, info log to your tuner, that stuff's all pretty straightforward.
Okay.
So
gotcha. We always start with tuning. That's your best bang for the buck. That's the first thing we recommend to do when you buy a truck. You don't need the intake right away. You don't need the lift pump right away. You don't need intercooler pipes right away.
Yeah.
Start with the tune. You're going to get the biggest results for the least amount of investment.
I would say so.
What comes after tuning on these?
So I always kind of practice this as, what kind of truck do you have? If you have a 3500 HO truck, you're going to have the ASIN transmission, which we all know is a pretty badass transmission for the most part. That transmission can definitely withstand some more abuse compared to what the 68 can. If you have a 68, the valve body in the transmission is generally your biggest weak link. So if we're looking at this from a power performance perspective and you own a 2500 or a 3500 standard output, the valve body in the transmission is generally something I would recommend doing. Now, I always preach to guys, do the valve body early. Do it early with the truck when it doesn't have a ton of miles on it, because in all reality, if you take care of the truck, the valve body is going to preserve the life of the trans. And we've seen this. We've seen a ton of trucks come in and out of the shop that have 50, 60,000 miles. The valve body failed. It took out, it took out gears in the transmission, or the transmission had premature issues, and those things could have been avoided if the faulty valve body from the factory was replaced. So we've seen, stock trucks with valve body upgrades and minimal trans upgrades, handle 500, 600 horsepower. I'm not saying that that's going to live forever, but
sure, if
you priced out what a 68 being built is, like
$8,000 to start.
If you're lucky
to blink at it,
if you're lucky enough to find one for $8,000, and there are some trans builders out there that are starting to become more competitively priced, and the pricing starting to come down. But like we've always worked with RevMax on stuff, and I mean, just their entry level trans is $9,000.
Yeah.
If you want to get into a 700 series transmission like what I had in my 15, that's a $14,000 endeavor. That's just the trans.
Just the trans.
That's not labor fluid. Like, that's the trans.
You're not even making more power with that. You're just able to harness more power.
So
that's so crazy.
I've always said, like, if you have a standard output truck, and this doesn't just apply to the 5th gen. This applies to 4th gens. Like, the $1,000 to $1,200 you're going to spend on a valve body upgrade is money well spent. Like, it truly is. And then to go a step further, if you have the plan of maybe doing a turbo upgrade in the future and you tow with the truck, well, it might be smart just to throw a converter at that and call it a day. That's what I did on my truck.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
Like, we did a
RevMax valve body, and then what do you do?
Valve body. I did a RevMax converter.
You did a RevMax converter.
Did a RevMax converter. We did a RevMax valve body in that thing. I did a billet flex plate as well, just because it was right there.
What was the drivability like with that setup?
So you can definitely tell the way the triple disc on the transmission, how it shifts or how it locks up. It is a little different compared to the factory converter. It's a little bit more positive. We've been playing around with some of the trans calibration and just kind of ironing out some of that aggressiveness just to streamline it and make it a little smoother. But I'll tell you right now, I'd rather tow even my boat, for example. I'd much rather have the converter and the valve body in motion than the factory trans. It's not as mushy. It's not as soft. It shifts, and you can feel that more power is being planted to the ground.
Yeah.
And you're able to maintain more line pressure to help with the clutch coupling.
Yeah, I know the 68. I remember the first time I drove a 68 truck. Slush box is all I could come up with. It just it short shifts. It kind of hops around where you don't want it to, and it just,
the downshift is clunky. It feels like the trans is about to drop out of it. Like, it's just not pleasant.
Yeah.
I always joke around with guys when guys call in. They're asking about, what would you do or what truck, blah blah blah. I always say, like, the Cummins is probably the least impressive truck. Like, if you're going to compare drivability,
oh
hell yeah. Like, that's my preference, right? Like, if I was going off of what's most impressive, I'd have a Ford, but I would never truly want to own a Ford. Like, that's just not what I prefer.
They're They're so hard to beat.
They're so hard to beat.
Every mathematical bone in my body says the 6.7 Power Stroke is the best diesel on the road right now.
Oh, I mean, from a refinement and drivability characteristic, they are a very, very, very difficult platform to beat.
Yeah.
But, hey.
And they got really the position on the windows is just perfect to rest your arm on.
Yeah, that's true.
Can't get around it.
But all the fellow Cummins guys out there, we didn't choose to go with a Power Stroke. We chose to go with the Cummins.
That's right.
There's a lot of cool amenities that those have to offer, but the way they drive is not one of them. So.
That $100,000 truck you bought, not optimized for driving.
Not optimized for driving.
All right. So we do the tune, we do the valve body, we do the torque converter. Hey, flex plate, if you're there, that's I think
it would be more or less like, in all joking aside, like the valve body is a given, just do it, and it's a simple install.
Yeah.
The converter is a little bit more of a process to do.
For sure.
I generally don't recommend that to guys unless they have goals of wanting to do more and use the truck a certain way. But the valve body, bare minimum.
Like if you plan on doing a turbo down the road,
then
probably safe to just get the converter done and get it out of the way.
Yeah.
You also, if you're not going to do the turbo for a few years, you could live without it.
Oh, for sure.
Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. So that gets us past the trans. What's next?
So this is some of the stuff now that in prior years, like with the 4th gen trucks and the 3rd gen trucks, it would always be a turbo as the next upgrade, right? Like that would be the next limiting factor. But from a lot of our customer base, that's generally not the next upgrade. They're either doing something like an intake air ram. Banks is making a lot of noise right now with their monster air ram that they're offering. And rightfully so. There's a lot of things going on right now that make that product fairly viable. One being the grid heater bolt, which we actually have a 6.7 in the lot right now where this grid heater bolt got ingested into the motor, blew the motor up.
Can you explain that a little for somebody who's not into like the 5th gen forums?
So this isn't just 5th gen.
What is going on?
This is 5th gen and 4th gen.
Okay.
This is 6.7 in general. But you have a grid heater that lies on the intake plenum. Okay, that's what heats up the air for cold starts. There is a 10 millimeter bolt that sits on the inside of your intake. Okay, on the grid heater, on the webbing, if you will. Okay, it holds like the grid heater to the intake element, and that's what basically signals for it to get hot and cool off. Okay, that bolt will actually vibrate and back off. And once it unbolts and backs off, it's not external, it is internal. So it goes right into the intake of the motor, and then it gets ingested into a cylinder.
I was just talking with somebody, one of our turbo builders downstairs has an older Cummins, an 05, and I was talking to him about it, and I said, Cummins guys who aren't out there with big C stickers, everything they buy for the truck is based out of fear.
Of course.
Because you're just worried about
but even the
what catastrophic thing could go wrong. But like a bolt in the intake plenum.
Yes.
In the intake plenum.
Inside. Yep.
You're like, man, we've had diesel trucks on the road.
What a piss-poor design.
We've had diesel trucks on the road since 1989?
Probably 85, 86.
Something like that. Yeah. Like, the fuck were you thinking?
Piss poor design. And you say Cummins guys buy stuff out of fear. I mean, even the guys with the big C's are buying it out of fear because they want you to know what they got.
Yeah.
Like they're afraid. They need you to know.
Fair enough.
You can hear them halfway down the road, but they want you to know. But yeah, no, it's one of those things where it's like it's such a shitty design, and now you have companies again like banks who are like, hey, like we can relocate this grid heater, and the install sucks. Let me just be honest with you, because the fuel lines, the fuel rail, everything has to get moved because a new plenum goes in place and then the new horn. But we got it done. We're doing some testing here in house on the dyno, so we'll have more to come in a few weeks. But that's one of the parts that like, what gains do you see? Like if I don't do a turbo upgrade and I wanted to do that from an insurance policy from not having a grid heater issue, are there performance gains?
Wasn't the 5.9 had a big monster intake horn too, right?
It had a smaller one, but Banks
offered like the big monster.
This fits right in their product line for everything that they offer. Okay. It's just now you can relocate the grid heater and you have that added whammy, that added bonus.
Right.
Other things that we see a lot of, and this was something that I was kind of shocked on, the driver's side intercooler pipe on the 5th gen is plastic. Okay, so just like prior year trucks and some of the other trucks on the market, those plastic intercooler pipes over time have a tendency to crack. That could form a boost leak. So Worley Custom Fab, one of the sponsors of the show, they have released intercooler pipes for the truck. Banks offers some as well. And then, of course, you have the different cold air intakes, right? Like intakes are becoming popular, even more popular by the day. You can drop an intake on a truck and, there's some crazy claims out there of some pretty impressive power, but what do they actually make? I don't care about the company marketing the product. 30% more airflow, 40% more airflow. Is the airflow the restriction? What's it going to make on the dyno?
I've always had this question about intakes because we have seen wild claims. We've seen fuel mileage claims based on intakes.
And we've also seen some impressive gains when we did the L5P intake shootout. We changed my mind. We saw some companies that made me take a step back and be like, okay, well, I have to see the bigger picture. There are gains to be had. That is a restriction.
Yeah. And it's also, as far as shit goes for your diesel, it's affordable.
When you look at it, right? I've always tried to coach guys, spend money where it's needed to be spent. And for me, I want to be able to see a return on whatever that investment is. You're not investing something to make money on it, right? It's never going to happen. But you want to be able to see a change on the truck. You want to better the truck.
Yeah.
You don't want to do something just to do something or have it hurt the truck's performance.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to just be dollar per horsepower, which I think is usually a gauge we use
there's
around here.
Dollar per reliability. There's long-term, efficiency there. There's a lot of things that come into place. But, when you look at one of these trucks, we've had trucks on the dyno, right? Other fifth gens, and a stock 68 truck will, with a tune, being limited in the tune, will make about 460 horsepower. Baseline 330. So pretty impressive, right? I know when you go on the website, we claim the power numbers differently because of what the truck's baseline from the factory, but realistically on a 330, it'll make roughly 440, 450 horsepower, okay? You put a valve body in there or you get a HO truck with a badass Ace and trans, we could make about 500, 510 horsepower, okay, at the rear tire. So pretty impressive numbers. Maybe not L5P world, not Power Stroke world, but in their own right and what they baseline at, they're impressive.
Sure.
So what do you gain if you do an intake? What do you gain if I do an intake air horn? If I listen to what some of these companies are saying, I should make 550, 600 horsepower, all joking aside. So, for us, it's okay, maybe you're not ready to spend $3,000 or $4,000 on a turbo upgrade. Turbos are expensive.
Yeah.
What are you going to gain if you do just an intake and an intake horn or intercooler pipes to improve on that? These are parts that are probably going to have to come into place when you do a turbo upgrade anyways. So here's the opportunity to kind of get it out of the way, and that's currently what we're dealing with now.
Right. Okay. Intake is worth it. Intake air horn is worth it. Oh, man, that brings your truck up to that 500 horsepower. We're not going to recommend deletes.
No.
Not just because the EPA won't legally allow us to recommend deletes, but
also
because
we get paid by them. We've had that accusation. So.
As an agent for the EPA, God, I'm missing that check. Yeah. But no, in all seriousness, what we've seen deleted trucks come in that have this same level of performance upgrades. They have an intake, they have the intake horn, they have the valve body. The only difference being is that their tuning allowed them to delete the emissions equipment. We don't see a massive gain in fuel mileage, and we don't see a massive gain in horsepower. We see very similar results. What I would call notable, but not significant.
I would say if we've done some back-to-back comparisons, on the 15 truck, or my old truck.
Sure.
When that truck had the compounds, the truck made 640 to the tire, Mustang numbers. And I want to say that same truck, same configuration deleted was within about 5-10 horsepower.
Oh, wow.
And I always joke around, I could take the same truck on the dyno, and any of our calibration listeners out there, back me up on this. You run the truck 10 times on the dyno back to back, you're not going to get the same number. You're going to get within that 5-10 horsepower, variance. There's a percentage of.
Yeah.
And we've seen that even in the truck where we went to a single turbo. We did try to do some comparison, emissions on, off, controlled on the dyno to say, is there back pressure limitations? Is the exhaust a lingering, a hindering aspect?
Sure. Or even if we're making the same power, do we have double the EGTs
exactly.
because of the emissions equipment?
Is the system working harder to create the power? Yeah. And, we've seen up into that 650 kind of number, you can efficiently, reliably make a good amount of power on one of these trucks, keeping it emissions legal, and they're still fun to drive. Now, when you look at the emissions as a whole on a 5th gen Dodge, they seem superior to what you would see in a 4th gen. There's all 5-inch piping that connect your filter and your cat together. You have a true 4-inch downpipe off of the turbocharger. These are big pipes and they flow. So we've been talking for the last couple of years, like, hey, we want to push the envelope and see what this is capable of. I'd rather see it on one of our boss's trucks than mine pushing the envelope. But, it's one of those things where once you get down that rabbit hole, it's hard to come out of. So we'll see what happens.
Tell you guys a little secret. Tell you about a conversation I had. I was talking with Nick about some change-ups in the fleet. This is usually around the time of year where our boss will sell a truck and buy a truck. Yeah. It's pretty standard for when it gets cold out. I told him he made some suggestions. He's thinking about getting rid of the Ford, and making some other moves. And what we were talking about is like, I love the Ford. We have this really cool 19 Power Stroke with everything we could throw on it, emissions equipped.
It's a cool regular cab with a lift and a turbo and a fuel system.
It's been sled pulling.
It's a cool truck.
It's been drag racing. It's been dynoed. It is one of my favorite trucks in the fleet. Yeah. But what I told him was like, man, we did everything we could with this competition-wise, and nobody cared.
Yeah,
it just never made a splash. And he's like, I'm really going to argue with you when this comes up again. He's like, but just remind me we need nitrous. I'm like, I think that's a part of the future as we start to put these plans together. Whether that's on the 5th gen Cummins platform, that might be what he jumps into. He might jump into a different Power Stroke. Who knows?
I think that goes into there's a couple different areas of the market, right? Like, are you trying to prove a point in just having a high horsepower truck that compete with other high horsepower trucks? Like, that's one side of the business.
Sure.
And the reality of it is, for a lot of the people that we deal with over at Calibrated, they use their trucks, they work their trucks, they tow with their trucks, whether it's professionally or recreationally. They use their trucks as a tool to get them from point A to point B with, their family trip on the weekends or their hot shotters or whatever the case may be. So a lot of times, a lot of guys are looking to improve their truck's operation to be more efficient, more effective, offer a better driving experience.
Yeah.
Nitrous isn't going to fit those bills, which we all know that. But these other parts that we're talking about are going to be key elements to, okay, I want to make this power. Okay, well, there's 100 ways to skin a cat. We've all heard that phrase. But what are these parts going to do? Are you going to see less RPM out of the turbocharger? Are you going to see 3 or 4 less pounds of boost, which equivalates to less drive pressure, which again, the system works more efficiently? Can I throw an intake on a truck and can I get some fucking sound out of the truck? Can I hear the turbo whistle? Can I hear the turbo spool up? To me, I'll pay the money if I can hear the turbocharger when I'm driving down the road. Like, I want to hear some of these things. I want that old school diesel.
There's so
with
much
the refinement
engineering
of the newer
around
stuff.
Noise, vibration, and harshness being
canceling,
reduced.
Yeah.
Yes,
and here we are.
Like, rip all the insulation out. I need to hear it.
But it's just, it's about a balance, And I mean, you get into these newer trucks, like, I'll tell you right now, man, I never thought 10 years ago, when I started here, that here we'd be 10 years from now and I can even afford a truck like that. Like,
sure.
They're expensive. Let alone rip it apart and have more miles racked up on the dyno than I put on the truck myself. But, it's really cool to kind of get that feedback and kind of get some of that data. So when we do get guys that trust us, right, and reach out to the company, and whether it's myself or any of the other sales guys or the support guys, it's like, hey, we'll talk the talk and we'll walk the walk. Here's the data. Here's what you can see. This is what we can realistically do on a truck like yours. By the way, we have something similar.
So. All right. I love it. All right, so we got intercooler pipes on this thing.
Yep.
We've got an intake horn.
Yes.
We've got tuning. We've got a valve body, potentially a converter.
Yep.
Next up's a turbo?
Next would be a turbocharger. So what I think we're going to do is, we already know, like on these trucks, 550, 575 is probably the cap off of the fuel system. So for the listeners, it's a 2019. It's been CP3 converted. So the dealer CP3 converted under the recall. So we're going to see what's the limitation there. And then from there, we'll, once we do the turbo, we'll see the limitation on the fuel system, and then we'll start doing some fuel upgrades. I've always ran fast stuff in the past.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of always been my go-to for lift pumps. They released some snippets at the PRI show. They're going to be offering a drop-in tank style, similar to
the Fleece setup?
Similar to the Fleece stuff. So that's going to be something to look at.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to see okay, we know the turbocharger factory-wise is going to cap off at about 510. My estimation is about 510 to 525, somewhere in that ballpark.
Okay.
So we do a turbo upgrade. Is it worth 30 or 40 horsepower on a factory fuel system. And then if we do a lift pump, is it worth anything, or do I have to jump up into a stroker pump again? But realistically, I'd like to see that truck replicate similar to like where the 15 was, which was around that, 620, 630 number.
Has anybody pushed one of these newer trucks to its limits? Do we know where the connecting rods will hold up to?
I mean, there are plenty of guys in the world, in this industry now, making 1,000+ wheel horsepower on stock motors.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So, like, that stuff all still exists, right? And, again, that's not our wheelhouse. That's not what we deal with. But, for me, it's just, I think 600 horsepower is the best balance. If we're talking a truck that is going to drive well, tow well, get good mileage, you could throw your wife the keys to the truck and have her take it for a drive and, you not be like, oh shit, she's going to crash this thing. I really think like that 600 horsepower is that balance of the versatility of the truck.
Yeah, I've told so many people, like, you'll never legally use more than 600 horsepower on the road.
Yes.
You don't need it.
No.
Like, it's fun to have. I'm not talking to anybody out of more power.
Bragging rights is key.
Yeah. But to actually drive down the road, I mean, as hard as you want to stomp the throttle, you're not going to get any quicker acceleration off the stop sign. You're not going to pass anybody any more efficiently. It's like once you hit that 600 horsepower, you're like, I'm playing with fire.
Yeah.
Like I'm juggling hand grenades. Yeah. Who knows when the pin's going to fall out.
No, I agree.
Chris, these are really, really cool trucks. Like you mentioned, you have one. You're going through some work on it here. Are we going to do a future episode and go beat the shit out of your truck on the road?
I think, as we were recording this, the truck was being ran on a dyno, so we're getting some final numbers out of it. I'd like to get a podcast underway, do a review on the Whirly intake, because that was something that we agreed on doing. I could tell you we've had a 24 Ram, like I said, floating around here, and that has the Whirly intake on it already. And what a difference turbocharger-wise, man. Like you can hear it. It's audible in the cab. It gives it a nice sound. It's enjoyable. So I wanted to get some sound clips of that. I wanted to get some real world feedback of us behind the wheel of the truck. So I'm excited, just to kind of get into that and, kind of see where that project takes us. So yeah, no, I'm excited to get out of here so I can go see what it made, so that maybe we could talk about that next time as well. So,
well, let's wrap it up, guys. Thank you so much for joining us for today. This has been Paul Wilson
and Chris Ehmke.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us today, guys. This has been Paul Wilson
and Chris Ehmke.
Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you again soon.
If you're going to back into it from the Paul way of thinking, like you're not wrong. I mean,